Welcome back to another episode of the What's Your Grief podcast. This is Eleanor, and as always, I'm joined by Litsa. Litsa, what's new? How's your week been? What's going on?
My week's been pretty good, actually. I think that I've been busy in a good way. I've been back to actually going to yoga regularly, which has just been good. You know, it's good for your brain. Good for your brain. So I've been doing that, and yeah, I don't know, just feeling okay this week. How about you?
I'm pretty good. It's been one of those odd weeks because it is Memorial Day weekend. And so Friday, some of my family had off and some did not. And the weekend ahead is a busy one. Do you have plans for this weekend? Or are you just biding your time before Succession?
I'm just biding my time before Succession, basically. It's exact counting down the hours is I forgot about Memorial Day weekend. I've just been thinking about it more as a Succession finale weekend.
I'm so curious to see how it ends.
I am too, especially because I think the writers have said from the beginning that they sort of always knew the ending. Like I think I heard something that said it's not like it's been evolving as they go. Obviously other pieces of the show have, but I'm curious. I can't wait.
I'm curious because I feel like throughout all the seasons, it's kind of like this will they, won't they? Like, will they succeed in like taking over a business or successfully moving on from the business, getting out of the grips of it, or will the business kind of take over them essentially?
Yeah.
And I'm curious to see if the finale is just a resolution to that or if there's something more.
Right. Because I think the other question has been the sort of the relationship between the three kids, and like, will it sustain or unravel? Will it stay all through the show? Like, there's just been the questions and alliances, and I'm just really fascinated to see where that ends.
Yes. And of course, because, I don't want to spoil anything, so I guess I won't get into the grief aspects of it, though I feel like if you don't know.
Oh, I think the LA Times, literally, I think by the LA Times spoiling it for everyone, if you didn't watch it, if you didn't have it spoiled, you saw all of the articles being angry about how it was spoiled for everybody. So
yeah, by now people know.
Yes.
Someone important dies, and there are a lot of really interesting expressions of grief, expressions of probably something that we want to talk about today, just kind of like grappling with mortality and our sort of existential questions. Actually, I wasn't planning for that to be a segue into our topic, but it actually feels
but it is a good way. And I think one of the things that again helps with how well the existential piece works in the show was something I heard the writers talking about how they did the death and why I do think people were so genuinely shocked by it if it wasn't spoiled, is because one of the things they talked about is how the way deaths often happen in real life, if it's not a person who's been sick and an anticipated death, is like smack in the middle of real life. You don't see it coming. All of a sudden there's a phone call, everything else nothing's been pointing to it. And then it just knocks everyone off of their feet completely. And that they really, really thought long and hard about how to make sure that happened in the show, that like viewers felt the same feeling that the family would feel of being kind of caught completely off guard by it. And I think they did such a good job with that. And I think for a show where, in earlier seasons, they did deal with some illness stuff and you did think, well, maybe they're maybe anticipating this. They did such a good job of bringing us along to this place where it makes total sense that it knocked everyone over completely, and that there's now this kind of existential internal and external battle going on about it.
I think all deaths obviously have the ability to make us think about questions about life and life's meaning and mortality. And honestly, we were just saying this the other day. We often don't always acknowledge that one of our grief responses is to think about ourselves a little bit and to think about our own mortality and to think about how we're spending our time here on earth, because really it's not about us, right? It's about the person who died and it's about the people who are affected by that death. But I think that it's just like this inevitable thing that a lot of us as humans do go to. It's this place we do go to. And I think going back to that idea of these really sudden deaths, I think that because they happen out of the blue, we weren't expecting them. Maybe they seem out of order. Maybe they seem like, oh, how could that happen to this person? They were young. They seemed healthy. I think those things do make us realize like, oh my gosh, this could be anyone at any time. And it has happened maybe to somebody we love very dearly. But I definitely think it's normal for these thoughts about other people in our lives and ourselves to creep in a little bit.
Yeah, I think it disrupts the logic and order and reason that we put to the world that's often not real, but we create a sense of safety and security by allowing ourselves to believe that we have time.
Yeah.
And I think that we have time with the person who died. Like we think we're going to have more time with them than we do. But then I think we can't help but realize the other implication is that we think we have time and we have no idea actually how much time we have. And when it's, with any death, but often these, sort of unexpected ones, I think the intensity of that feeling of, oh my gosh, I actually have no idea how much time I have. It's hard to not feel that in grief.
Oh, gosh, yes. I think that as an example, like my mom died at 57, and just that issue of time and age really is something I think about all the time right now, even though it may be totally irrational. Like my mom was a different person, like there's no reason other than the small genetic, component to the type of cancer she had. There's no reason for me to believe the same thing is going to happen to me. But I do think all the time, I do the math in my head because I have a little one. I unexpectedly had her a little later on in life. And I am constantly thinking about like, what age will I get her to if I live the same amount of years as my mom? And so I do think like it does make us think a lot about how much time do we have? Like the same thing could happen if you, even sometimes you might not even know the person, but you hear about someone your age dying of something. Like I think it's a normal thing to like be like thinking about that and like wondering about that and like worrying about, might that be me? Like it's not necessarily healthy to like fixate on it, right? But like I do think it's a normal response that a lot of people have. But like I said, we don't always acknowledge it. One, because people don't like to talk about these things. Like people do not like to talk about death anxiety and existential questions. Not everybody, but a lot of people don't. And two, like I said, I think it does make people feel a little bit selfish to be thinking about themselves when someone else has died or someone else is really suffering, or when you are really suffering for someone else.
Yeah, I think that is a big part of it. It does. People do feel like it's selfish when it certainly is not selfish. It's like human, and from an evolutionary perspective, like our deepest drive is to stay alive, like to keep ourselves alive, to keep the people that we love alive. Like that is our deepest biological drive. And so when something happens that disrupts that, I feel like it would be hard. It would be going against our biology to not be having these sorts of thoughts.
I guess an important caveat is like the thought is not selfish, but Lisa, you actually have an interesting story about this, I think. But if you then show up, for the person or comment to the person like, oh gosh, this makes me think about myself. Now that is selfish, right?
That is so true. So true. At my dad's funeral. I mean, it wasn't at the funeral. It was at the funeral home, like the viewing or whatever you call it. Viewing. I hate that word. My friend at the time, her stepdad, I was only 18 when my dad died. So, were still pretty young, and her stepdad was somebody that my dad hated, like hated her stepdad for reasons I won't go into. But her stepdad came up to me at the funeral home, and he was so emotional. Like you could see he was visibly like so upset. And this was a man who was like already a walking midlife crisis at the time. And he, we start talking, and essentially at the funeral home, like what he says is he like starts observing that he and my dad were like about the same age, and basically that it is like bringing up his own mortality stuff. And at the time I was just like, this is unbelievable. And if my dad were here, he would appreciate feels like the wrong word, but like appreciate that this is exactly what was happening, and would be like, of course this like guy is, of course this is what he's upset about.
So save it for your therapist or your journal, or people who are not grieving the same that loss.
Yes. But among people who you feel safe with, or who you can talk to about it, I think it is important to, that you can acknowledge it. And if nothing else, that you can not beat yourself up for thinking like, oh gosh, this is so awful and selfish. Right. No, this is just something we do. And I think it's important to be able to acknowledge that.
Well, you brought up midlife crises, sort of, not really. You said it in your story, but it made me think, what are people doing when they have a midlife crisis? Like they're really like reevaluating how they're spending their time, or trying to sort of latch on to the feeling of being younger a little bit, right? And sometimes I think how we respond to that sense that time is limited, time could be slipping, we're getting older, it can be a little bit harmful and destructive, if you're going to blow up your life and, go out and do all those cliche things we think about with midlife crisis. It might not be the most constructive, but I do think on the other end of the spectrum, a lot of people, when they have a loved one die, it really does force them to step back and like maybe reevaluate, or maybe it clarifies for them what really matters in life and how they want to spend the time that they have. And maybe it teaches them a lesson about how much they want to cherish the people in their lives, or, there is a lot of different ways that we see this happen. But I do think that that's one kind of impact, is us looking at and re-examining how we're spending our time.
Absolutely. I think that when we realize, in not just an abstract way, but in a way that has hit so close to home, that our time is limited and hence more precious than maybe we had been giving it credit for, or, when we start to look at the ways we had been spending our time and the relationships and the things that we've been really being grateful for or not being grateful for, I think it does have that ability to be very clarifying. And I think, much like the midlife crisis, there can be a risk with that, right? Like there can be a feeling of very early after loss for some people of like, I need to change everything right now, right? Like I need to quit this job that I don't care that much about, and, upend my entire life and start taking seriously what I want to do with these remaining days. And I think in extreme versions, that can sometimes lead to making rash decisions that happen a little too quickly. But I think as long as it's not that extreme example of, I'm going to upend everything without giving it a lot of time to make sure that this clarifying of priorities feels the same way at 6 months as it did at 6 weeks, that it can really help us to feel like we're moving more consciously and mindfully and deliberately forward in our life, and feel like I always feel like that in a weird way is sort of like indirectly a connection or a bond that I have with my dad, and really in a slightly different way with my sister's partner who died, John, like in different ways, both of those deaths made me aware of my own mortality and also aware of being lucky to make it to a certain point in life. And so in that way, I think I let my gratitude as well as my a little bit of my like always there sense of my own mortality that I do think helps me to live my life in a more mindful and thoughtful and conscious and deliberate way. I kind of think about that as a connection to them in a way that I find comforting.
Yeah, you kind of, I was thinking like similar things as you were talking, and you came around to like kind of saying exactly what I was thinking, like, because I do think my mom's death has led me to feel both incredibly anxious about time passing between me and my kids, but also like has caused me to really hold on very tightly to them, and not in like a neurotic unhealthy way, but to like want to show affection to them while I can, and want to, you know, lay in bed for an extra like 15 minutes when my 3-year-old has crawled in with me, and like really made me stop and say like, these moments are so precious and I want to cherish them. And I don't know, maybe I would still realize that. Like, I don't know how I would, the thing is, I don't know how I would feel had my mom lived. I have no idea. But I definitely think about, you know, my mom a ton as it relates to like how I relate to my kids. So yeah, I think you're right. It can create, and this is what's interesting. Sorry, I'm like jumping around a little with my words here, but I think that, you know, when we talk about it bringing us clarity and whatever, I think sometimes it leads people to think like, oh, we've reached this higher plane of enlightenment. And the reality is, no, it just presents this paradox where it's like you, on the one hand, feel like anxiety about the fact that time is passing, or sadness or whatever, or about the fact that your mortality is there. Not everybody, but I will say for myself, I do. But on the other hand, you feel like gratitude and a push to be like really present. With the things that matter in life.
Yeah, no, I think that's, I mean, I think that's exactly it. Even if looking at it from like a really philosophical point of view, I mean, I can't remember. I'm sure I've talked about this at some point on the podcast. Like my undergraduate degree and my first master's degree are in philosophy. And a lot of that was because I think that I was going through a lot of existential stuff right after my dad died. And I took an intro to philosophy class, and I was like, wow, people are just asking these questions. Like this is a thing that you can just study, is people asking these big questions about life. And I found a lot of comfort in that. But, you know, there's a number of different philosophers. I mean, Heidegger especially literally uses this term, being towards death. And the idea that like when we are beings towards death, which is for him, beings that are consciously aware and thinking about our own mortality and death all the time, that it is that paradox that like you are then that you're a person who's thinking about your mortality and your own looming death. But that what he talks about is that actually allows us to see the world more clearly, to see what's important to us more clearly, to value things in ways that feel more consistent with, you know, maybe the people that we are when we get all the other messy, like boring life stuff out of the way, that we can actually kind of see through some of that stuff to be able to find the things. But it like, you have to have one to have the other. Yeah. Like he kind of says, you have to have this awareness of your own death and the difficult feelings and anxiety that goes with that in order to also have this other piece.
Yeah. Okay. I'm going to go deeper in a
Let's go.
These are the thoughts that enter my mind at night, and I don't allow myself to go down the rabbit hole.
That's what we're here to do, though. We're here to go down the rabbit hole.
Nobody ever wants to go down the rabbit hole, but I do think like we're talking about it helping me and clarify like sort of the positive side of it. But I do think that there can be some very scary thoughts that are associated with this kind of thinking. You know, for many people, it again, looking at the positive, it helps them to clarify, you know, their view on spirituality and afterlife and faith and a higher power and so on. But I do think for some, there might be the fear that like, is there a point to all
right.
of this? Or are we all just like grains of sand, you know, that get washed away and eventually like the world just like moves on? That's a scary, to me, that's a scary thought. A lot of people have found peace with that. But for me, I have not.
I think it's a really hard. I think the idea of finding peace with it, I don't know, maybe there are truly people who find peace with it once and then they keep that peace with it. But I almost think of it more like an unactive process, like that you make peace with it again and again. I think because I'm certainly in the category of I guess a true agnostic. Like I don't know, right? Like I don't know. But I also feel like I make peace in an active, ongoing way with the very real possibility that we are just grains of sand, and it means nothing. And I think maybe again, part of the way that I do that in an active way, or why I think of it as active, is because of all of that reading philosophy that I did, and the idea that there's nihilism, where we can just go and say there's nothing and that's awful, right? Like there's nothing, and then all that leaves us with is dark emptiness. Or we can do what the existentialists say to do, which is to say, because everything is empty and meaningless, everything is possible. And so we get to decide like what makes it meaningful, and that we each get to like choose that path every day by looking at what makes it meaningful. And I think it does feel a little scary, because I think we like the idea of there being a prescribed meaning, like it's like the 5 stages. Like people like the idea of the 5 stages because it like puts a logic and order to it, and it says this is how it is. And I think that there's a lot of comfort in that. And I was raised in a religion that, sort of had an order and logic to things. Yeah. And
to me, it feels like a bit of a yes and situation, where it's like, yes, that's a sad thought, and that will always be a sad thought. And all the things you just said, and it's amazing that we are here, and every, you can find things hopefully in every day that are wonderful. I think a lot of people want to push you past that thought and tell you not to think it, or tell you, you're not evolved for thinking it. I have felt very judged for having thoughts about this stuff, especially ironically, or maybe not ironically, I don't know, in this space, in the grief and bereavement space. I feel is like not at all tolerant of people feeling like expressing death anxiety and feeling that death is bad.
I totally agree yes, I agree that is the vibe, unfortunately, in this space.
There's this feeling that we should like be embracing of it. It's a part of life. And it's like, yes. And that is tragic to me. Like that is tragic to me. I love being alive. I love all the people in my life. And it is tragic to me that is the case. Like, I don't have to be cool with that. Even if it's a part of life, there's a lot of things that are a part of life that I am not cool with. I'm getting older, I'm aging. Like, I'm not cool with that. I want to be 20 again, I want to look like I'm 20 again. You know what I mean? Like, I want to have the brain of a 40-year-old with a better memory and look like I'm 20. But yeah, I do feel like for me, it's always going to be a yes. And it's always going to be like, yes, that is really scary, like thought. And you get to live every day. And I'm with you. Like, I think I'm I think I'm more in the middle. Like, I don't know. I don't know why we're here. I don't know what comes next. I like to remind myself that there have been times where we fully thought that like the world was flat. Like we fully thought like a lot of things that now we look at and we're like, oh, that was wild that we thought that, and we're fully convinced of it. So I'm like, what else don't we know?
Oh yeah. Yeah, no, I completely, that's absolutely how I feel. I do feel like in the truest form, sense of the word, I am an agnostic, because I have no idea. And I've, had experience. I think there's two things, I guess I would say that are interesting about talking about it in the grief space. Is there is that sort of feeling in the grief space sometimes that like we're supposed to be evolving to some place of just being content with our own deaths. And like I'm with you. Like I'm not just I'm not there. Like I'm not trying to get there. Like I'm not somebody that feels like we need to get there. I'm somebody who's okay with the idea of being sad to die. Like,
yeah. And I honestly, I'm with you. Like, I'm not trying to get to that place. And I honestly feel like that doesn't make me a worse person to be in the grief support space. I honestly feel like that helps me because I believe you when you say that this is tragic. I'm not going to say like, oh, that's just a part of life. Not that I know a lot of grief professionals that are saying that, and I hope they're not, right?
yeah.
But I do think that it is perfectly fine to believe that that's not something that you should be chill with.
Yeah, like it's okay to not be okay with it. Like I don't think we need to, and I think this question comes up, right? Sometimes with people who are working in the hospice space and when they're working or with people whose deaths are anticipated and who are terminal, and there's this desire to get people to the acceptance of their own death in some way. And I think in a lot of ways that is something that makes the people around the person feel better. Like it's for us. Like we don't want to sit with somebody's death anxiety while they're actually dying. We don't want to sit with the fact that they're devastated about their own death. And I think if people can get to a place of acceptance of their own death and a reduction in anxiety, the anxiety, I think that that's fantastic. I think the research that they're doing now around psychedelics to try to ease death anxiety is really interesting and fascinating. I also think it's not the only way. It's not the only path, and that, it's okay. Like, again, feelings aren't good or bad. They just are. And we can feel this fear about it, or this, not ever being comfortable with it. And that's okay too. And that's the thing I wish there was a little bit more space for conversation about in this space. And I think the other thing that's hard is, that I think being someone who is truly agnostic, I also think is a benefit, because for people who have strong faith and belief in an afterlife and all of that, I think like that, absolutely, that might completely be it. Like I both 100%, I can both sort of 100% think that might be it. And simultaneously, for the people who think that there is absolutely nothing other than we become part of the earth again, and, energy is never destroyed. And so we're still somehow part of this physical place, but that's all. I also sort of 100% think that could be it. And in that way, I find that helpful. Like I actually... yeah, I find it helpful that I kind of fully can be in both of those places at the same time. But I do think sometimes the conversation in the grief space for people who really do use their belief in an afterlife and experiences that they've had with mediums and with other, things like that, when that has... honestly, it's such a huge part of the grief space. Like the number of books on, even I was just reading somebody who was talking about on Grief and Grieving, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's book that, at the end of her life, and that she and David Kessler wrote. And this person was reading it for the first time and was like shocked about how much things like the afterlife and mediums were part of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's life and work at the end of her life. It's just always been a part of the grief space for some very prominent people in the grief space. And I think that sometimes talking about that, because it is so important to some people and such a source of comfort to some people, then makes it hard to, I don't know, talk about, well, like, yeah, maybe there's an afterlife and maybe there's not. And like that it's, right. There's a lot of people on the other side who are, very confident there's not. And yeah, I don't know. It makes it tricky.
I think as people who exist in this space, both as professionals and as people who have been grieving, I think that what we need to acknowledge is that we do go through all these different questioning and exploration. And that is such as like a individual experience. And so we kind of have to just allow for people to reach their own conclusions, and if one person wants to go to a medium, I mean, that's not me, right. But if one person wants to, that's fine. That's where their searching is taking them. And if somebody has a really strong faith, like I'm really glad for that, because that's an excellent support in their grief. Like that's a good thing, And so I think just allowing for all these things to exist and, you were talking about how we often want people to reduce their death anxiety and come to a place of acceptance when they're dying. And I am with you. Like, I don't think we need to force that either. Like, it's wonderful if people can get to that place, if they want to get to that place, if there's help to get them to that place. But it's also okay, not to want to go quietly into that dark night. Like, that is perfectly fine. Like, my dad has made it abundantly clear he is not going to. And I do remember, I think I've probably even recently mentioned this on the podcast, there being some sort of turmoil between like my mom not really wanting to accept that and people wanting her to. And I've heard in a lot of different professional spaces that we're in, like people saying things like, oh, this person only has 3 months to live and they're not accepting of that. What do I do to help them accept that? And I'm just like, I think because of my experience with my mom, I'm like, you let them feel how they feel. Like it is not your job to force someone to get to a place of accepting their death.
Yeah, because it would be easier for everybody around them. It's true. And there's so much work, right, in the dementia space now about, how we should, there's always been in all forms of helping of, we should meet people where they are. But, I think dementia is especially interesting because stopping this inclination people have to correct people or push back on, and, on things when they're confused about where they are, time and things like that. And it's just interesting that I think we do have this feeling of like, wait, well, if somebody's dying, I want to use this time to push them to get to that acceptance place, when really I think there's a lot of space to be able to say, like, the reason it's so hard to accept is because life has been so amazing and being alive has been so amazing. And that, of course, as humans, it's really hard for us. And I think to get comfortable with the idea that these sorts of tensions aren't a flaw or a failure. I think even in the spirituality space, one of the things that I think people worry about when grief creates a crisis of faith, and where there may be questioning of if there is a God and what the nature of that God is, and questions about the afterlife and all the things that we know come up for people while they're grieving, that one of the reasons they don't like to articulate that, or that they have problems sometimes, is because they share those anxieties with other people of faith, or sometimes even with their faith leaders, and are sometimes met with deep, deep criticism and, feelings that it is somehow not godly to question God, or that it's somehow their failure as a human that they've done this. And one of the reasons I appreciate Kate Meyer's work so much and what she's done is really talked about that idea that if there is a God, like, God can handle every bit of that questioning. And we were created as beings with the ability to question, and that remarkably for most people, when they go through a crisis of faith and come to the other side, if they do come to the other side of still having that faith, they feel that that faith is stronger than it's ever been, because it withstood that everything, that questioning. And I think being able to sit with that, the tension of all of those things, it's so important, but it's something that sometimes people are just not naturally inclined to do with grievers.
Yeah, I do think one thing that's important for everybody to remember is that questioning, like you said, can lead to deeper understanding. One of the areas, in fact, of post-traumatic growth is spirituality, where, and people who know about post-traumatic growth will tell you, like, post-traumatic growth happens when things do get torn down to a point where you don't know which way is up, and you don't know what's right, and you don't know what's wrong, you don't know what's true, you don't know what's false. And so a big part of that is questioning it and building it differently, or rebuilding. And so with that, in the area of spirituality, a lot of times it's like, because things got so torn down that you had to ask some really big questions and you had to seek some really deep answers, that then you sort of build it back in a way that's even stronger and that has grown. So I do think questions can make people uncomfortable for a wide range of reasons, but like, it's very normal, and it can often lead to greater understanding.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think in every faith tradition, major faith tradition, questioning and stories of people who have been questioning are part of the history of almost every faith, and not in ways that those people are demonized or talked down about in things like the Bible and in other faith works, but actually as something that is just looked at as human. And so I think it, even coming from that perspective, it's that faith perspective is this belief that this is part of our humanity, this questioning. It's not a failure of our a failure for us as humans.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's a big topic.
It is a big topic, and obviously it's one that you and I have both thought about a lot and could probably go on all day about. So we'll wrap up here for now. And we invite you to email us at whatsyourgrief@gmail.com if you have any thoughts about this, any suggestions for related topics or unrelated topics. And also, we're going to include some information about our community for people who are grieving. What we just changed the name. What did we change the name to?
The What's Your Grief Hub for Learning and Connection.
Yes, I'll remember that in the future.
I mean, it's a little bit of a mouthful, so we'll probably just be calling it like the hub.
We are doing sort of periodic enrollment, so that helps us to better bring people into the community and orient them to the community and so on. So there's periods of time where registration is open, and then there are periods of time where it's a wait list. And so right now we are registering for our summer cohort. We're going to be doing lots of really good stuff in the community, lots of learning type of stuff, lots of artistic kind of stuff. Of course, we have conversations there for those who want to have conversations and have connection around a lot of different topics. So we really encourage you to check that out. And you can always email us if you have questions about that as well.